Hello, welcome to C.A.R.S. Today I am going to be featuring 7 specific yet very different vehicles, each of which I have actually owned. Now I will tell you this, if you want to see the exact colors and you want to see the specific details of which vehicle I actually did own as opposed to these stock photos, take a look at the playlist. Notice the link in the corner of the video. And that's going to be old videos of new cars. So, with that, why might I be doing this video? Well, number one, for fun. I enjoy doing this sort of thing, and I wanted to do something different with my channel, dive in a little bit more deeply. In fact, if there is a specific vehicle you would like to focus on, feel free to skip around using the chapter function that you will notice with this video. But if you do want to stay for the long haul, I will be covering each of the different vehicles that you see displayed on this screen. So, with that, let's go ahead and take a look at each of these 7 vehicles. 3 likes from each one, though I could list more, and 3 dislikes, and yes, I could list more than that for at least most of these vehicles. But we're going to focus on some of the differences and what I liked best and what I liked least about each of these different vehicles. And this will also be in chronological order, starting with my very first car. Alright, on that note, here goes car number 1. Alright, yes. The 1986 Subaru GL Sedan. That was a great way to start out with a first car because, as you see here, it was maneuverable, it was comfortable, and it was fixable. So I could maneuver it in and out of traffic, it was easy to park, easy to get in and out of driveways, all of those sorts of things. That was helped also by a decent amount of ground clearance, especially in the front. So it was really nice for a first car. I had just received my driver's license. The car was old at that time already, but it was great for each of these aspects. Very maneuverable. Given the type of car it was actually quite comfortable. The seats were very padded and comfortable, but yet they weren't just super soft either, so that was nice. And I learned how to replace timing belts thanks to help from friends, and my brother helped me a lot. We changed out the timing belts and all sorts of different maintenance items on the vehicle. And so I learned a lot, from paint work to brakes to suspension to basic maintenance like oil and oil filter changes and tire rotation and all of that. So maneuverable, comfortable, and fixable. Now for the dislikes. It was underpowered, especially by modern standards. It had like 90 horsepower or so, so especially when it needed a tune-up and it needed some maintenance, if I was trying to get on the freeway, I had to plan for it. I basically had to put the pedal to the floor and leave it there from near the beginning of the on-ramp until I was merging with traffic. So that took a good while. But hey, it made it fun and interesting. And as far as it being unreliable, that is with a bit of a caveat because that is by modern standards. So given that it was a 1986, it was probably average reliability when it was new, but when I had it, it was getting a bit older and it needed a lot of love, a lot of maintenance, and it just kept adding up one detail after another. But I was always able to get it to be drivable with that help that I mentioned, and it still was a great first car, great project car too. But as far as the costly side of things, the repairs were starting to get to the point where if I really repaired it as nicely as I'd like, the repair cost would end up being what the vehicle was worth at the time that I sold it. So those were the dislikes. But as far as the car itself, it was great. A lot of fun, nice Subaru boxer or horizontal or flat engine, whatever you want to call it. And it was fun because the spare tire, like Subarus of that day, the spare tire was in the engine compartment, so you had to open the hood to get to the spare tire, or the bonnet as some parts of the world will refer to it as for the hood. But with that, let's go ahead and take a look at vehicle number 2. Yes, it is the 2005 Kia Rio Sedan. So this one was my first brand new car, so go figure that would have been in 2005. And it was a sweet little car. There were a lot of things that I really appreciated about it. Incidentally, this happens to be one that is the identical color of what mine was. It looks like it may even have the same options, just judging by the front fascia and so forth there. But let's go ahead and talk about the likes. So it was affordable, hence why it was my first new car. I took out a loan on that one, and thankfully paid that off before too long. And it was also very maneuverable. Nice short wheelbase, easy to park, all of those sorts of things. And it was economical, so not only was it a low-cost vehicle, but it also got quite decent gas mileage, especially for 2005. There were others out there with better gas mileage, but for a 2005 non-hybrid vehicle, it was very, very nice. So did what I needed it to do, and I'm very glad that that was my first vehicle. I had looked at one or two others, one that might have been a little bit more expensive, one that was maybe a little bit less expensive, and it seemed to be that Goldilocks just right spot for me. So I'm very glad to have had that as my first new car. As for the dislikes, fit and finish, low power, and it just simply was not sporty. Well, the fit and finish weren't terrible by any means. I know of one or more current manufacturers where the fit and finish is probably pretty similar to what the Kia Rio was, but just little things like the paint was very, very thin, so after not too many years, because this vehicle stayed in the family after I moved on to a different vehicle, the paint started to deteriorate a bit alarmingly quickly, actually. And just certain little things with how, like, the hood lined up, or bonnet if you want to call it that, how that lined up when it was closed, and certain panel gaps and so forth. They weren't like luxury car perfection or anything like that. But it wasn't bad by any means. But it was something that did catch my eye because I have a real eye for detail, especially with cars, and so that just happened to be one of the first things that I noticed with it. And then, of course, again, it was low power, a little bit more than my first car, the Subaru GL, but still not anything super fantastic powerful. And that goes along with the not sporty character. So the design, the transmission, the engine, all of those things was not sporty, but at that time I wasn't really wanting to buy a sports car. I just wanted something that would be new and start fresh and have a good warranty and be able to go from there. All right, but now for some real excitement. Are you all ready? Okay, here we go. Alrighty then. How about that? The 2007 Dodge Charger SRT8. Now that was a switch. Going from a 1.6 liter four-cylinder engine to a 6.1 liter V8. And yes, the vehicle weighed more. The Dodge Charger weighed roughly 1.5 times that of the Kia Rio, but it had almost 4 times as much horsepower. Yes, it had 425 all-American muscle horsepower. So that brings me to the things I liked about the car. Modern classic styling. So it had the modern twist, but yet still it had classic features. It was an American V8. It had twin exhaust pipes. It had the V8 rumble to it, and it was front engine, rear wheel drive, and it was a big car by modern standards. And of course, the Dodge Charger is still being made today. In fact, the horsepower options have increased and all of that, but for those in the year 2022 currently following automotive news of various sources, you know that there's going to be a major changeover at Dodge. But back to this particular vehicle, also very spacious interior, and as I mentioned earlier, the horsepower, 425 horsepower. That was a lot of fun. As for the dislikes, parking, as you can imagine, this car was 200.1 inches long. So that was longer than a lot of SUVs and certainly longer than a typical crossover. So parking was a bit challenging, especially with the rims there. I was always extremely careful where I parked so that I wouldn't be damaging the rims, because that's something that can happen with any nice size rims. Those were 20-inch rims. And then wet traction. I had one adventure one time. This was my first car ever having electronic stability control, so I thought, well, I've driven all this time without it. Let me try driving without electronic stability control. Let's see, what kind of difference does this make? So I was getting onto a freeway on-ramp, a 70-mile-an-hour freeway, and it happened to be raining. And this was an automatic. And for that matter, all the Dodge Charger SRT8s at that time were automatics, and so it kicked down a gear into, I think, first gear, and traction broke loose, and I ended up drifting while getting onto the freeway. That was unintentional, so it was rather exciting and a bit scary looking at the fence posts on the edge of the on-ramp and facing toward them instead of them being on my left side. Well, thankfully, with some counter steering, thank God, I was able to correct and let off on the gas, and it snapped back into the direction I needed it to go. And as it snapped back, I counter-corrected the steering, and it all lined up straight. So there's a lot of things I'm sure many of you could be saying right now, like, oh my goodness, you don't want to do the letting off on the throttle abruptly because then it'll spin out and snap the other direction and all that. Well, thankfully, it ended up working out pretty well, and that vehicle also had a close 50-50 weight distribution, so it naturally was balanced. It wasn't wanting to spin around very easily, so not too much consistent oversteer or understeer, but I could go into more detail at another time if I wanted to. Fuel economy, go figure, with a modern twist on a classic pushrod V8 engine, 6.1 liters and all of that. Fuel economy was not the best, but it also was not terrible. For 2007 standards, especially for a full-size sedan, it was reasonable. All right, with that, there was another fun vehicle after this one. All right, here we go. Okay. Yes, it was the 2010 Mitsubishi Lancer Ralliart. Notice that last word, Ralliart. No, this was not the Evolution, or Evo for short, but it did have essentially the same engine, the 4B11T, but it was, so to speak, detuned in this particular vehicle, and certain suspension components and so forth were a bit different. But it was a very fun car nonetheless, and it was a really nice follow-up to the Dodge Charger. My likes were steering feedback. Oh my goodness, this had the best steering feel of any car I have ever owned or driven. There's a big difference between the Dodge Charger versus this one. I could almost feel like if I were to run over a dime on the street, it would not surprise me if I honestly could feel that if I was going at like 30 miles an hour, to be able to feel that through the steering, because it was extremely precise feeling. It was almost like I could feel the road through my fingertips. It's hard to explain, but that is almost not an exaggeration. All-wheel drive, that was great. So for wet traction, I thought, you know what, all-wheel drive is the solution. One of them, anyway. And I figured I wouldn't have issues with spinning tires quite as much or almost spinning out. But hey, that kept life exciting with the Dodge Charger. But with this, I was ready to try something different. Also, it had very quick shifts. It had what was called a dual clutch transmission. So it wasn't just a regular automatic, what some people jokingly call a slush box, where there's a torque converter and it's spinning around and you basically just have a viscous coupling with the transmission fluid and you aren't directly driving the wheels. That's what a typical, what you might call standard, if you want to use that term, automatic is, as opposed to a manual or true standard transmission where it is directly coupled with the clutch. This is basically in between. It was a clutch that was directly coupled, and there was some lubrication in that clutch, but it was a twin clutch, and that clutch would be automated. So instead of having an actual clutch pedal, the engine computer, transmission computer, and so forth, all of that was moving the clutch. So it wasn't as engaging as having a manual transmission, but yet it was much more direct and true to the sporty nature of manual gear shifting, much more so than simply the slapstick that you could do with the Dodge Charger if you put the automatic in, so to speak, manual mode. So anyhow, very quick shifts, a certain number of milliseconds and all of that. The paddle shifters were really nice, and it would do rev matching and so forth. So steering feedback, all-wheel drive, and quick shifts, those were great. The dislikes were understeer. So I talked about the steering feel, and one of the things I would feel is understeering. Like if I would be turning right onto a main road and I would be accelerating at the same time, especially with the turbo kicking in, it would understeer to the point where I would end up pushing wide, so to speak, and I'd end up in the other lane. I maybe was trying to turn right into the right lane. Maybe there are two lanes going in the same direction. So no problem there. It was a huge safety issue, but if I wasn't careful, I'd end up crossing over the lane line, and that happened a few times for me. Just two lanes going in the same direction, nothing crazy, not like oncoming traffic like that, but still significant understeer. One of the reasons being that this was the Ralliart tires and not the full-on Evo tires, though they were summer tires, and they were great, but there was understeer. The transmission that I mentioned, it was super quick to shift, but when you would just be starting out from a stop, as it would engage, it basically felt like somebody who was still learning stick shift, because the engine computer was not as smart as some engine computers, and the way that the clutch system was designed, when it would engage, it would kind of jerk sometimes, so it really felt like you were in a car where somebody wasn't quite up to par with their shifting. And it literally was because of the clutch. But again, there was no clutch pedal. It was all run by the computer system. All right, so that initial engagement would be that way for the transmission. And then electrical quirks. So there were a few different unusual electrical quirks that ended up going on. So one day I was driving, and all of a sudden the anti-lock brake system warning came on for no apparent reason, and then went away. Another time I went to get into the vehicle, and it was acting like it was completely dead, but checked out the battery. Battery had plenty of charge to it, and basically the computer had gone into some kind of limp mode, and disconnected the battery cable, reconnected it, and guess what? It was fine, started right up, no problems, and I took it to the dealer, and they showed some concern, but other than noticing the trouble codes and making sure that everything was reset okay and functional, they said nothing was wrong. So I don't think they even had to flash the software or do any kind of firmware updates or anything. So understeer, rough transmission, and electrical quirks. All right, well, that brings me to the next vehicle. Alrighty, the Nissan 370Z. This was a true sports car. If any of my vehicles could truly be considered a sports car, not a muscle car like the Dodge Charger, and not a very sporty car like the Mitsubishi Lancer Ralliart, but a true sports car, something that's light, nimble, and quick. This would be it, out of any that I have ever driven. Well, what did I like about this sports car? The acceleration, for one. 0 to 60, according to Car and Driver, 0 to 60 in 4.6 seconds. And all that with a high revving engine. It would rev up to like 7,500 RPM. So when you'd be shifting the gears up and down, that engine would really sing, especially over 6,000 or 7,000 RPM. It was awesome. And sporty styling. Very, very unique car. A lot of fun. As far as just to go on a fun, sporty drive, I would say this was the most fun out of any vehicle that I have ever owned or driven. As for the dislikes, well, as with many sports cars, there's going to be some drawbacks. One of those here was poor visibility. So some of the lowest visibility out of any modern car. The only real competitor to this would be the modern Camaro. Both of them are pretty similar. You had high door sills. You were looking through almost like a slit to look through the front window, and if you ever had to put down the sunshades, the visors, then it really was a narrow field of view. And as you can see from the rear, there was not much to see out through. In fact, you can almost see one of the little tiny porthole windows on the rear there. You can kind of see just a hint of light shining through, but it mostly looks like you're looking into a black darkness inside the car there. Is a two-seater car. And speaking of seats, very low seating. So that gave a go-kart-like feel, but when you had to get in and out of it, you had to be careful as you sat down because the roof line was so low. You had to really sit down to get in, and then to get out, you had to really climb out. I mean, the ground was just right there when you opened the door, and you had to just sort of crawl out almost. So it was kind of fun that way. It kept it interesting. But the most challenging thing, I would say, other than, while driving with the poor visibility and so forth, the most challenging thing was the freezing door windows. So like a few modern vehicles will do, when you would open the 370Z doors, the window would automatically roll down a fraction of an inch, and then when you'd shut the door, it would automatically roll up. Otherwise, it would hit the door frame and around the roof line, and you could damage the window, you could damage the door frame or the seal around the roof line. So it had to be functioning correctly. So thankfully, I always had a good battery in the vehicle, so it wasn't that was an issue. But in freezing weather up in Washington State, where I was living at the time, those windows would freeze, and so if the windows froze, it wasn't just a matter of getting the door unfrozen and opening the door. The window had to come down. And a lot of times, from rain, of course, and snow and all of that, water would get down in around the door windows, and so that would freeze. So even if you could unthaw the door and get the door open, which wasn't too much trouble, the window would not go down in the process and would not go back into place. And so there were a number of times I had to drive through the parking lot at work when I'd be working late and the windows would be frozen, and I'd have to be holding the door while I was driving and then get some more water in some water bottles and pour it all around until finally it would thaw out the window. And it might be like a 15-minute process just to be able to get the door window to open freely enough and close freely enough to be able to shut the door securely without damaging anything and be able to drive home after a late shift at work. So yeah, that was the big one for me. But let's go ahead and see what I decided to do instead. I decided to go almost the opposite extreme. I thought, you know what, I'm ready for something different. Time for a change. Let's see what I got next. All right, yes. It was the Subaru Forester 2.0 XT. So not just any Forester. This was the one that had the same engine as the Subaru WRX. In fact, the WRX ran less boost, but the WRX did have a little bit sportier top end to the engine. So ultimately the WRX did make more power, but it was fun to see the boost gauge, and yes, this had a boost gauge, an electronic boost gauge that you could see on the dash, stock from the factory, because of its sporty focus. And I remember seeing like 19.4 pounds per square inch or PSI of boost getting onto a freeway on-ramp once after an oil change. So that was pretty cool, I will say. So what did I like? Well, I loved the great ground clearance. We had what was called Snowpocalypse shortly after I traded in the 370Z and got the Forester 2.0 XT. And I was so happy to have ground clearance to keep from getting beached up on the snow, because there was a lot of snow for Washington, Western Washington. Excellent visibility, total opposite of the 370Z. I thought, you know what, if I'm going to make a change, I'm going to go big or go home, so to speak. So I decided to go ahead and go for it. Now, as far as the size, though, of this vehicle, it was, you know, just a relatively small crossover, compact crossover, not like subcompact or anything. But it was obviously larger than the 370Z. But anyway, excellent visibility. And I wanted all-wheel drive again. So I was ready to make that change, go with all-wheel drive, get some good traction there. The 370Z had summer tires, as the Mitsubishi Lancer had the summer tires, so it was nice to have something with all-season tires. Yes, I know they're not really a master of any condition, but at least they were great for what I needed at that time. Alright, so ground clearance, visibility, and all-wheel drive for the likes. Now, for the dislikes, multiple recalls. Almost as soon as I purchased the vehicle, there was a recall. And then another recall with that. And then pretty soon there was another recall. And before long, the dealer that was helping me at that time had to do a recall on the recall, because the parts that they put in for one of the recalls, they found out that it was actually the wrong part for the standard Forester and not for the 2.0 XT, which was the sportier version, and the list goes on. But recall after recall, and I honestly lost track of how many recalls there were. They all got taken care of, and none of them were huge safety issues or anything like that, but there were so many it was crazy. The next thing was rattles. Nothing big, but a little bit of a clunk and rattle sound around the back hatch, and didn't seem like there was any major issue with it. I talked to a dealer about it. Nothing was ever really found, and I decided not to mess with it. Fuel economy, that was another thing. Unless you drove in the intelligent drive, the most eco mode that you could, fuel economy was not that great. And in that intelligent drive, the engine sounded like it was lugging a lot. It was really bogged down and would stay way too low in the RPM range and below the turbo kicking in. So it was not a mode I wanted to stay in most of the time, unless I was really trying to just let it just gently sip fuel. So fuel economy was not terrific. It was better than like the Dodge Charger, but it was definitely not terrific fuel economy with the all-wheel drive and all of that. So it worked, did what I needed it to do, but those were the dislikes there. Alright, so now it is time to go to the last vehicle, and yes, this next one is my current car. Here we go. Yes, the 2021 Mazda Mazda6. So, what did I like and what do I like about the Mazda 6? Because again, this is my current vehicle. Well, I love that exterior styling. It looks very swoopy if you look at the front, like the front fender. Very nice design. Looks like an airplane wing. Reminds me even of a more gradual curve like you might see in the front fenders of some of the old classics from the 1930s. So, yet at the same time, a very modern style. So, kind of all the styling cues that I really like about some of the other vehicles over the years, and yet a very modern look at the same time. Also, comfort. One of the most comfortable cars that I have ever owned, ridden in, sat in. Very comfortable. Comfortable seats. I feel like when I sit in the driver's seat, it actually corrects my back just by sitting there. And I've sat in some seats where it's like I can't wait to stop sitting down because my back's hurting right now at this seat, whether it's inside of a vehicle or some other chair somewhere. But those seats are some of the most comfortable seats, more comfortable than many comfortable chairs. And so I really like the seat. And yet at the same time, it's not like super cushy. It's actually rather firm and sporty, but yet it really works with the human spine. And that's what Mazda was designing with those seats. They really did a good job there. And then the feedback to the driver. So other than the Mitsubishi Lancer Ralliart that had the very best steering feel, this one is a very close second to that steering feel. The Mitsubishi had hydraulic, like the classic style hydraulic steering, power steering. But this has electric assist steering, the Mazda does, but the feel is very, very similar. I can not quite feel if I were to run over a dime in the same way that I would with the Mitsubishi, but very, very good feel, a good weight to the steering. It feels very natural. It feels very connected. It doesn't feel like I'm just playing a video game by any means. And the brake pedal feedback. Like when I am getting off the freeway and slowing down on an on-ramp near my house where it's downhill and you're just coming off a 70 mile per hour freeway, you have to be able to slow down. And it's not an extremely long off-ramp either. It's basically just pretty straight and then fairly steep downhill, and then you have to stop at a stoplight right there for cross traffic on a main street. And those brakes work really good. They feel like they actually want to stop. They want to slow down. If you push harder, they'll slow you down more. If you let up a little bit, they will draw back a bit with the braking. And so it's very linear. Probably the best brake pedal feel of any vehicle I've ever driven. So that's really nice feedback. Maybe the brakes aren't going to stop you as quickly as with the Dodge Charger. Those things could stop you on a dime. But the feel is very, very good. Very solid, but not like stomping on a brick like with some brake pedals out there. I test drove a WRX once and it felt like I was just pushing against something solid. It didn't feel like I actually could get the travel to feather in the brake pedal as I wanted to with that WRX. Whereas with the Mazda, great feedback with the brake pedal. All right. So, dislikes. I have noticed after several thousand miles of driving, I've noticed some rattles around the dashboard. Nothing crazy, but just some rattles around the dashboard and around the driver's side, passenger side door area. I'm not even sure what's rattling. I've double-checked things, and I don't think I'll talk to a dealer about it, but it's just enough to grab my attention and to be a bit annoying. The fuel economy, even though it's a 4-cylinder engine, it is turbocharged. It does have 250 horsepower, so that's less than the 370Z or the Dodge Charger, but more than any of the other vehicles that I have owned. So go figure, it is going to burn through some fuel more, even though it is a turbocharged modern 4-cylinder engine. And the other dislike is dealership locations. So in order to get my oil changed at the dealer, which is what my preference is, yes, I know you can get great quality oil changes elsewhere. You can even do it on your own if you really want to dive in. And of course I did that with my first car, no problem. But if you want to get it done at the dealer, have them do it, well, I have to drive an hour to go to the nearest Mazda dealership. So that's a bit inconvenient. But thankfully, it's not like it has to be done every day. But that is a dislike. So some minor rattles, average fuel economy, and the long distance to get to the nearest dealership location. All right. Well, if you all stayed through this whole video, bravo, thank you so much. But hopefully everybody got a chance to hear and see something that they were interested in. So, thank you all so much, and I will look forward to telling you more next time on Cars.